you have three different buckets. And each bucket is going to represent a different use. It's not so much about what are my returns, Kamie. It's more about where do I pull money from when I need it.
But the buckets bring stability and hopefully a little bit of stress-free living?
Yeah, exactly. So a treasury is actually a government bond issued by the United States government, 100% guaranteed by the U.S. government. In theory, the principal is the safest investment in the world.
I love thinking about working 30 years, 35 years, and being in retirement for that same period of time.
Welcome back to another episode of Retire and Thrive, where we help you live that next chapter with purpose, wealth, and confidence.
Dan is the expert. I'm here to ask the questions. My name's Kamie. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope that you have subscribed to this channel to get education or anything you need, any tips, advice about retirement. Even if you're 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, this podcast is for you. It's always good to learn different things you can do with your money and how you should prepare for eventually retirement. Today, we are talking about buckets, guardrails, and paychecks. I don't know how they all go together yet, but we're going to learn.
Thank you. So this lesson is all about portfolio checkup. And yes, Kamie, we're going to talk about all three of those things.
Okay.
And we'll kind of dive into each one of those separately and kind of show you what that really looks like.
Okay. Looking forward to that. How are you, by the way?
Everything's good.
Good.
Yeah.
Have you dealt with the mosquitoes yet? They've
Oh
been
my
out,
gosh.
man. We live in Minnesota and they have come to life with all this rain.
The humidity definitely is out. And when I wake up in the morning and the windows are drenched,
Yeah.
you know it's humid, and you're right. I mean, the mosquitoes are not a good thing.
Yes.
So.
I was pulling weeds and they were biting me like crazy. So I was already mad because I was pulling weeds. And then you have the mosquitoes. So that's what we're dealing with here in Minnesota. But let's talk money today. So buckets. We're talking about buckets. Don't have buckets of water sitting out because the mosquitoes will just grow and they'll lay their little eggs in those. But I don't think we're talking about those buckets today.
Not today.
We're talking about three buckets.
We're talking about three buckets. That's right.
Okay.
And I think for retirement, it's not necessarily specifically about, again, we touched a little bit on last episode is checking your investments all the time.
Right.
But it's really about designing a portfolio, that I refer to, you commented on the buckets. It's really designing a portfolio that, I hate to use the phrase all weather, because we've seen lots of turbulent weather here in the markets in the last, going back as we've talked about before, last 5 years. But yeah, so we're talking about three different types of buckets.
But the buckets bring stability and hopefully a little bit of stress-free living?
Yeah, exactly. So the bucket theory is this, and it could be called different things. But ultimately, the way that we look at things in terms of the bucket theory is you have three different buckets. And each bucket is going to represent a different use. And so again, it's not so much about what are my returns, Kamie. It's more about where do I pull money from when I need it? And so, the first bucket that we talk about is really your short-term needs. So, and this applies not just necessarily to retirees either. This can apply to people that are in the accumulation phase. And so that short-term might be if something happens to my car or my roof, or you need a new furnace or whatever it might be. And so we invest that accordingly. And so I look at that first bucket really is a short term. Some people may refer to that as more of an emergency fund.
Right.
Feeling like you're going to ask me the next question is how much do you need? Right?
Well, no, I wasn't, because you never have an actual answer for me. It depends on every person and their lifestyle. But let's go percentage wise, I guess. What are we looking at for that first bucket and that emergency fund?
You're not going to like it, but it does depend.
Of course it does. Of course it does.
And what I mean by that is this. It does depend, because that short-term emergency fund or that bucket that you may need to tap into depends on if you drive a 3-year-old car or you drive a 25-year-old car. It depends whether you live in a house that's 5 years old or 35 years old. So what I always tell people is in that short-term needs, think about all the things that could go wrong.
Right.
I mean, most of us have health insurance, so we've got coverage there. But outside of that, what are the things that can actually go wrong in your life?
Yeah.
And for me, I start looking at all the things that can go wrong, and whether it's, both homeowners here. So whether it's something that goes wrong with the house, whether it's something that could go wrong with a vehicle or medical expenses, people have different deductibles. So
right.
So,
Make
so
sure
it does
you can
depend.
cover your deductible.
Right. So it does depend. And again, I know I hate to use that word, but it does.
But I think many of your clients, I'm sure, and all of us really dealt with that during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
Have that emergency fund. If you don't have it, people were very stressed out, and a lot of people were asking for money and things like this, very worried about where their finances were going to go because they weren't prepared for something like that to happen. And maybe you were one of those people, or maybe you were someone who had that backup fund or that bucket filled so that you were prepared for something like that.
Right. And some people refer to it kind of as a rainy day fund also. And, as you said, during COVID, there was just all bets were off. And, we saw, grocery stores, people panicking and buying all the staples, but
and the toilet paper.
Yeah, exactly. So,
good investment.
So I would say that is the first bucket, and we generally like to fill the buckets up in order.
Okay.
And so that having that emergency fund, having that liquidity is important.
Yeah, and probably your most important, the first one you want to fill because you do need that if the refrigerator dies or if the washer and dryer go to heck.
And you had mentioned this last time. I just want to kind of circle back around on the last episode. You had mentioned, what if someone comes to you and they've got all of their money in cash, all of their money in CDs and so forth. And what we're suggesting is that this is a place where you would use some of that money for that.
Right.
Keyword was some.
Right. Some. Absolutely some. That is important. Not everyone follows that. But if you are not following that, this is the perfect episode for you, or maybe a loved one that doesn't really believe in investing their money. Let's talk about bucket 2.
Yeah,
so we have our 3 buckets.
Yeah, bucket 2 is more of, I need access to the money, but just not right now. And you might say, well, what would that look like? If I'm driving a 10-year-old car and I know in the next 3 to 4 years, I need a new vehicle.
Yeah.
That's more of what we would call more of the intermediate term, that you need access to it. And that might be from, say, 2 to 5 years from now.
Okay.
Or it might mean that, maybe you're in a house right now and you might want to buy a different house. And so you're going to need a little bit more of a down payment. It could mean that you've got 16-year-olds that are going to be going to college in 2 years or whatever it might look like. But that's something where you need the money, but it's just not for 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now.
Okay. So how does that look? Where are we putting our money? How do we know where to put our money? It probably depends on who the person is, but what is your best advice?
Yeah, my best advice is if you need access to money and it's, less than 5 years old, I think then it becomes let's make sure the principal, the original investment, is safe and secure. And then, Kamie, it's just a rate game. Where can I get the best rate? And that could be a CD. It could be a Treasury bond or a Treasury note. It could be, we went through a period of time a couple of years ago where money market accounts were actually paying higher than what maybe CDs were. So all of those are very safe and secure, but we want to make sure that we get the best rate we can. So if I wanted to buy a new home or sell my home and buy another home, but I needed extra money for upgrades, but I don't need it for 3 or 4 years, I might have $30,000, $40,000, and I don't want it just sitting in an account that's only paying me a small amount.
Right.
So maybe I go out on the spectrum and I buy a 2-year CD or a 2-year Treasury note. And again, if one of them is paying a little bit more, we know the principal's safe. And that's really the most important part, is we don't want fluctuation. If it's a known thing that we have to buy or that we have to use the funds for, like I mentioned earlier with college would be in that category too, you don't want to risk the principal. It's not worth it.
Sure. For those at home who maybe have some questions about what you just said, can you touch on what a Treasury note is and what a CD is? It might be simple for someone like you, but maybe someone that is just getting into this or just wanting to learn more. Can you explain those two things?
Yeah, thank you. So we would consider that a bond, if you will, in that category. We talked about stocks, bonds, and cash. More of not just necessarily a bond, but a fixed income. And there's lots of different types of fixed income. So yeah, we'll explore the bond investment 101 here for just a minute. So a treasury is actually a government bond issued by the United States government, 100% guaranteed by the U.S. government. In theory, the principal is the safest investment in the world. So very, very little chance of losing money as long as you hold it till maturity. Mm-hmm. And again, not to get too granular here, but they're short-term, called Treasury bills that are 1 year or less, Treasury notes that go from 2 to 10 years, and then Treasury bonds that go from 10 to 30. But the point is that it's very safe, very secure. Treasury notes 2 to 10 years produce an income every 6 months. It kicks out an interest payment. But that would be something that would be appealing for, again, something that you need and you just can't handle the fluctuation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then on the other side is a CD, better known as certificate of deposit. And think of them as like the government. In essence, the banks are paying, consumers or depositors in these certificate deposits. And oftentimes what you'll find is that bank checking savings accounts are going to pay less than the certificate deposit. And part of the reason is because what banks typically do is if you give them $10,000 and you buy a 3-year CD with that, they're taking that $10,000 and they're lending it out to somebody who maybe is buying a car. And so from their perspective, if you can tie it up for a year, they're going to give you a better rate than if you could go in tomorrow and pull the money out. So that's why if you tie it up, they're going to pay you a little bit higher rate.
Okay. Anything more about bucket 2?
Nothing more about bucket 2.
We touched on bucket 2. Moving on to our third bucket.
Bucket 3 is anything I would consider longer term.
Okay.
That you can withstand some of this volatility. And that really is your 401ks. It involves maybe portfolios, investing in the markets. And when I say markets, I'm talking both stock and or bonds. But that's really your long-term monies. Okay. And so kind of bringing this full circle is if I look at you and I look at your age and you've got money in a retirement plan, this is money in theory you can't touch for 25, 30 years. Mm-hmm. So keeping everything in an investment like the short term wouldn't make a lot of sense. Right. Because right now, money market accounts are paying somewhere in the neighborhood of between 3 and 4%. And I mentioned it on the last episode, but the stock market, just since April is up close to 30% just because it was at the bottom. Mm-hmm. But historically, as I mentioned earlier, that the stock market's averaged closer to 10% per year. Sure. But it hasn't been, we refer to it as a straight symmetrical line. I mean, it's been ups and downs and so forth. So, yeah.
So it's as easy as the 3 buckets. Have you noticed that it helps some clients that you've worked with remain stress-free or at least limit the stress?
Absolutely. And I think some of that shift happens too. And I want to just touch on this. When we talk about the 3 different buckets and how to put different assets in those buckets, also think about people that are retired, right? So we talk about an emergency fund, we talk about something that you may need, to purchase, and we talk about a car or a home or whatever. But if you're retired, you need a guaranteed secure income. And so it just, kind of triggered me a little bit when you asked that question. So imagine that you're 65 years old and you've worked really hard and you built up this 401k and you're drawing an income off of the 401k. And imagine a world like we saw in 2022 where the stock market, the S&P was down 20%. The bond market was down almost 14%. And imagine your $1 million all of a sudden dropped in value and you went from, say, $1 million to $800,000. I mean, it's like a gut check. I mean, it's like, but if you had 2 to 3 years set aside in that shorter term, doesn't really matter as long as the market eventually comes back.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you have that time.
Yeah. So for retirees, I think it's really important that you make sure that you have, sufficient money. And oftentimes people will say, well, how much should I have set aside and safe and secure? And a lot of that is based on your income that you're pulling out. Sure. So we have something that we refer to as a sustainable withdrawal rate. And all that's really saying, Kamie, is how much money can I pull out of my portfolio without running out of money? And of course, we have software that can analyze this. But just in a general rule, a lot of white papers, a lot of academic research has been done on this sustainable withdrawal rate. And if you take a portfolio, regardless of the dollar amount, if you had half of it in stocks and half of it in bonds, they say on average, you can pull out somewhere between 4 to 4.5% per year and increase that amount every year by 3% for inflation. And historically, you would have never run out of money. And so, if you're pulling that money out and the markets are going down and down and down, and we've been fortunate in the last, probably quite frankly, last 20 years where we haven't seen a substantial downturn for a long period of time. And I alluded to it in the episode before that when I was in my 20s and the technology bubble burst, that was a 3-year downturn. COVID was like a 6-month downturn and it came right back up. Right. And so having that liquidity when you're retired is really kind of a big deal. And whether that's 2 years worth of guaranteed income in something safe or secure or 5 years, I think a lot of that's just depend on, someone's risk tolerance or their comfortability.
Sure. So we've been talking about the buckets, and I think you've mentioned this throughout this podcast, this episode, some of the guardrails. We've touched on it briefly, but tell us more about the guardrails and how you, I suppose, keep these buckets in check.
Yeah, great great question. And I think the guardrails that I refer to is that when we look at someone's financial plan, we're actually looking at all of the income sources. And so what we're trying to do is recreate a paycheck for somebody once they retire. And so once somebody retires, they take their normal paycheck that they're getting and then they do what they do with it, whether it's for, their living expenses or whether it's to pay taxes or whether it's for college funds or whatever it might be. But then all of a sudden they retire and it's like, I have no income. So one of the things that we do talking about these guardrails is we take a look at where is all the income going to come from. And we'll get into this in another episode, but we break it down into different types of income. But when we look at somebody who's retiring, one of the things we factor in is Social Security. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's a whole lesson in and of itself in the book itself is Social Security. We have several employers in our town of Rochester that pay out a pension. And so we factor that in. And one of the things that we do is when we build out these plans, we figure out how much they need to live on to be happy. And then we look at all of these income sources, and then we start measuring what percentage of your need is already guaranteed or will come in the door every single pay period. So that's what we're trying to really do, though, as the guardrails is kind of recreate that paycheck. And the second component to that, Kamie, is it's not always a fun discussion to have, but when we see prolonged downturns like we did in 2022, one of the things that we've had, kind of some heavier discussions was, the markets are going down. You're very well diversified. We don't know when they're going to come back. Historically, they have always come back. But if this goes on for a couple more years, do you really need to be pulling out $6,000 a month from your portfolio? Mm-hmm. Because oftentimes what we'll see is that people will be pulling money out of their portfolio and they're just doing it because we're trying to replace their paycheck. But then it just starts building up in their bank accounts and they're not even spending it.
Sure.
So then we'll sometimes have this discussion to say, should we adjust your income instead of pulling out that $6,000? Should we be pulling out $4,000? Because now is not necessarily the time if the markets are going down. So that's another way to kind of adjust, the spending.
Yeah, that's very interesting and always something to keep an eye on. That's for sure. Just because you mentioned a pension plan through businesses, this is not related to retirement, but how important is it when you're looking maybe for a job for a business to have a pension plan? Like that's huge, is it not?
Yeah, that's really huge. In fact, I don't know the exact numbers, but I will tell you probably 15 years ago, there was over 10,000 employers that had pension plans. Uh-huh. I don't even think, when we look across the board, it's probably less than a third today that have.
Why?
Very few employers have pension plans.
Why?
My opinion is people are living longer.
Okay.
And so think of this from an employer standpoint. If I've got 10,000 employees and I have to pay an income to them for the rest of their life and people are living longer, it's this big element of uncertainty. Because if, I look at my parents when they were alive, they were born in the late 1920s. Life expectancy is you retire at 60, and by 65 to 67, very few people lived that long back in the 70s. Mm-hmm. Now, with the advance of, medical technology, people are living to their 90s, to their 100s. So imagine if I'm an employer and you start taking a monthly income and I have to pay that for another 35 years. Yeah. So I think one of the things that we've seen with businesses specifically that used to offer pensions is they've beefed up their match on their what we call the defined contribution plan, like the 401ks and 403bs. So instead of saying, hey, we're not going to match on the retirement plan, we're going to take away the pension. Yeah. And then we're going to match more on the 401k. Now, there is specific rules. I don't want to ramble on this pension thing too long, but you asked.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. And honestly, in my opinion, kudos to the companies that still offer the pension.
Yeah, it's absolutely huge if you found an employer. And I think you have to weigh the whole package, though.
Right.
I mean, are they matching in the retirement plan? Are they doing the pension? But that's, again, we'll get into the next episode, but that's an income source that shows up in your bank account every single month once you retire. And so it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it really is. Probably they didn't have pensions back in the biblical days, when they lived to be 700 years old or whatever. Right. Moses probably didn't have a pension, but nowadays some businesses do.
I did. If we've got time, I did want to tell just a quick story on how this whole bucket system Because I feel like, oftentimes I know you joke with me, I tell too many stories.
No, you do not.
But
your stories are great. It's so informative and they can relate with the folks at home because a lot of people are probably in the same boat.
Yeah. And again, been doing this a long time, so I've seen a lot of things unfold. And this is kind of like the perfect storm story. I brought on some clients back in 2010 after that financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Their portfolio was down something like 30%. It was just a horrible, horrible thing.
Did they come to you because of concerns?
That's genuinely, yes. They came to us. They weren't getting necessarily the attention that they felt they needed. They didn't know what direction to go.
Probably a little bit of stress and panic there.
Yeah,
too.
Absolutely. And they were, at that time, they were about 3 years from retirement.
Okay.
And so they did come to me, and they had a few things that they wanted to finish before they retired. And one was they wanted to put on a whole new patio on their backyard. And when they got the bill, this thing wrapped around their entire house.
Sure.
But long story short is it was like a $35,000 bill. And they just said, well, we can't sell with the market being down. And I looked at them and I said, I totally agree with you. And they said, but we necessarily don't want to wait for another 3-4 years. We don't know when the markets are going to come back. And so for them, I said, go visit with your banker and see if they'll extend you a line of credit against your house. Because at that point, they had their house paid for.
Sure.
So in that particular story, they actually went out, got a line of credit against their house. They pulled out that $35,000 against the line of credit and basically paid the contractor. And by 2011, 2012, their portfolios recovered. And then we pulled the money out of their portfolio. We paid off their line of credit. And interestingly enough, they then retired. And it wasn't even a few years later, they said we needed to reside our house. And in 2015, the markets were down again. And I said, that's the beautiful thing about your banker is when you need money, and you don't have to tap into your portfolio, you can access it.
Yeah.
So this is just one piece of advice, and this is just a very broad advice. But this is one thing that we do tell clients that are approaching retirement. I said, while you're still working and you still are eligible, talk to your banker about possibly getting some type of a line of credit, whether it's against your home,
Sure.
whether it's a home equity line of credit, or whatever it might be. Because oftentimes what happens is when people retire, as weird as this may sound, they might have a lot of assets, but lending institutions want that income to show.
Uh-huh.
And so if you're still working and you have a good income and you can take out that home equity line of credit, and as long as you can continue to keep that, doesn't mean you have to ever use it, but it's there as kind of a safety net. Yeah.
Yeah, that is the perfect storm and some good advice from somebody. So good. That is good. Well, thank you so much for sharing this somewhat simple. It simplifies it and helps folks, I'm sure, really find where their money needs to go. And if this is something that resonated with you or a loved one, or maybe you have a child or a parent that could use some advice, some help as they are reaching retirement, or if they're in any age, really, you can use the bucket system in any age, especially if you are younger. Start investing when you're younger, if you are able and have that money, because it is so important. And as Dan mentioned, we're all living a little bit longer.
Right.
So you have a longer retirement and you will need maybe a little bit more money. And I love thinking about working 30 years, 35 years, and being in retirement for that same period of time. If you're fortunate enough, that is fantastic. And it really helps you probably save a little bit more thinking, okay, I'm going to need this money. So the 3 buckets, it's as easy as that. Leave a comment below. Subscribe to our channel. We send out a podcast. We produce a podcast once a week. And if you have the notifications on, it will alert you when our next podcast is out.
Excellent. I do want to just mention, next week we are going to wrap up lesson 2 about checking in on your portfolio. But next week it's going to be more about, we refer to it as behavioral finance.
Okay.
And what that really is it's taking the emotion out of your portfolio.
Which is good and helpful. And I think not having emotion would be great.
Yeah.
Eliminating that stress. That's what we're trying to do. Help you out and give you some tips along the way so life can be a little bit easier and you aren't so scared when it comes to your finances. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you next week.